Welcome, Trojans. I am excited to be here today as your alumni host and to have the opportunity to welcome so many of you as we dive into this amazing topic. I have long been interested in exploring leadership styles and combinations, including what influences them and how they differ based on our backgrounds. This is no more vividly displayed than in the workplace, where I know we have all experienced many different leadership approaches. While some aspects of leadership are inherent, there is much to be learned to cultivate additional skills. Today, we have the opportunity to do just that from one of our foremost experts. Dr. Ange-Marie Hancock Alfaro is the director of the Center for Leadership by Women of Color and chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at USC Dornsife. She will share her new research on ways in which women of color transform research and the lessons we can all learn. Please welcome Dr. Hancock Alfaro.
Thank you very much, Giovanna, for that kind introduction. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking, if you're on the West Coast, your lunch hour, or if you're somewhere else in the world, a different hour to talk with us today. As Sarah and Giovanna mentioned, I'm going to talk about leadership as more than just a personality trait, as something that's really a process. And so I'm going to share my screen, walk through a few bits of the research that we do at the Center for Leadership by Women of Color, and then happy to take any questions at the end in terms of what you might be interested in or some of the extensions of our work even. So let me share my screen. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. And we have a couple of things that we have to talk about and unpack before we can talk about leadership by women of color as being something that is more than just a personality trait. So I'm going to walk you through kind of two things before we get to the Q&A. The first is I'm going to describe our approach. And you may have heard of something called intersectionality before. It's certainly a word that's gotten a lot more popular over the past 4 to 5 years. And so we're going to talk about why that approach is something that's really important and informs our work. And then second, we will talk about women of color's leadership in particular. And there are a lot of reasons for doing so. And so just to give you a little bit of a taste of why it matters to talk about women of color leadership, women of color entrepreneurs over the past 5 years, pandemic accepted, have been responsible for leading businesses that have generated over $400 billion in revenue in the United States. They are some of the fastest growing numbers of independent business owners women of color are across different sectors of women of color. As well as, of course, in political leadership, they have started to emerge as leaders, whether it's in Congress or in the vice presidency. And then in nonprofits and in educational institutions, there have been waves of deans and provosts and presidents of universities that have been women of color over the past 10 years. So there's starting to be a critical mass, in other words, which is why we think studying this sector is really important. But we want to start with intersectionality because, again, there's a lot of misinformation about intersectionality. And so we want to just be clear about what we mean when we're talking about intersectionality and why it's a valuable approach for studying women of color leadership. So intersectionality is really about how can we hold two truths at the same time? So two things being true at the same time. One, on the left-hand side here, you have this green figure, and that is really designed to capture the idea that we are all of who we are every single day and in every single way, right? So we're not just our elbow, we're not just our hand, we are all of who we are every single day and in every single way. And that is really a central truth about intersectionality. That's the one that you might hear about if you did a Google search or if you looked on YouTube for videos, right? That intersectionality is about identity. There's actually another almost more important context for intersectionality, and that is that this individual, as we all are as individuals, are embedded in structures that shape how much personal power we have, how much power we have in solidarity with other people. Again, another really important component that affects leadership. How much power we might have in a more intersectionally equitable context, right? So what does that vision of the future look like? And then power ultimately in how we transform society, right? No society is ever perfect. There is always a group of change makers who want things to be better for more people. And often over the past century, that has been women of color, not only women of color, but certainly there have been a lot of women of color who have been influential in our country in that way. So before we get to talking about intersectionality and how it impacts leadership, we do have to correct a couple of stereotypes. And so again, there are about 11 or 12 million hits you'll get if you were to Google the word intersectionality, and about 98% of them would be incorrect. And one of them is this idea that intersectionality is a Venn diagram. So this center figure here with race, gender, and class. And the way that this misperception works is that there is something called a race only part of intersectionality, or a gender only part of intersectionality, or a class only part of intersectionality. But again, if we were all together in a room, I would have you all stand up and then only sit down if you were just your gender on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, or if you were just your race on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And of course, I've done this over 10 years in rooms, and no one's ever sat down because we are all of who we are every single day and in every single way. And so this idea that you could pull out just the race part or just the gender part and then have a viable analysis is really not the way that we live our lives every day. The second stereotype is that intersectionality is only about race, gender, and class, and that we shouldn't talk about religion, or we can't talk about ability, or we don't include citizenship or sexual orientation. And again, that's a stereotype based on people not understanding the breadth of where intersectionality comes from, and also the different people that have contributed to intersectionality. So usually what happens is we boil it down to one individual, a very famous individual perhaps, but one individual as the founder of intersectionality. And that means that you're only reading two things or three things that they've written, and you don't look at this over a century, almost 2 centuries worth of women of color who have contributed to intersectionality. So this very busy slide really talks about the three kind of threads of intersectionality that have come up. You can trace intersectionality all the way back to 1831. And so again, often we think that it just happened in the 1980s or in the 1990s, but it actually goes all the way back to a free Black woman named Maria Stewart living in Boston, Massachusetts. And she was the first Black woman to actually give a speech to an integrated mixed audience of not just Blacks and whites, but men and women who didn't used to sit in audiences together in the 1800s. And so she was the first person to talk about we need to end racism and sexism together. That is notably before Karl Marx, and Maria Stewart was actually a strong woman of faith. And so again, if you think about just intersectionality in the contemporary context, you think it has nothing to do with religion, or you think it has nothing to do with Christianity. But in fact, it started coming out of Christianity. And I note that just because there are a lot of stereotypes floating around, even in the past 6 months, about where intersectionality comes from. The second narrative that happened is in the international context. And there was an Indian woman named Savitribai Phule in the 1890s who was organizing barbers' strikes. So she was actually talking about class and labor, but also talking about it from the perspective of gender and caste, and saying that you need all of those kinds of dynamics before we can really move forward as a society. And so again, this idea that intersectionality is something that is just one group of women of color's kind of property is actually, when you look at the history, a little bit more complex. And then third and finally, we have over here a kind of Los Angeles and California connection. You have folks like Mirta Verdal in the 1970s who talked about intersectionality in connection with national identity and citizenship status, and talking about the border between Mexico and the United States. And so again, talking about colonialism and talking about the ways in which that has an impact on women of color and the need for an intersectional analysis. So you can see here that there are folks from a variety of different locations, a variety of different historical perspectives who contributed to intersectionality. So it's really a theory by women of color about women of color. But the good news is that it has a lot to teach people who are not women of color as well. So it is not exclusively for women of color. The last thing that I'm going to say about intersectionality as kind of a framework that we need to remind ourselves about is that it really is a theory about how power operates. And so when we're talking about leadership and how leadership is different as it's practiced among women of color, we're not just talking about their identities. So this is not just having the right faces in the room, for example. We are talking about how they navigate systems of power. So the reason why I have this double helix here is that each one of us, as that little green figure, if you will, on the first slide, is placed in a different location on this double helix, right? So someone might be placed right here on this green part of the double helix, but they're actually trying to get to the center here. They're trying to get to be a good and healthy person, for example. And so they're traveling here, but they run into a lot of different experiences and a lot of different structures over the course of their lives that make it either easier for them to get closer. So maybe they're able to go from the green to the yellow to the orange kind of stripe here. Or there are barriers and things that make it harder that might push them back to the blue or the purple kinds of stripes, right? And so not only where people start, but as they're navigating systems and structures, they're moving closer or further away from their goal. And it's a really important thing to think about with regard to how power dynamics function, because of course, we all have a certain amount of control over our lives. But I think if we've learned anything in the past year, it is that we do not have perfect control over our lives. This pandemic has taught us there are structures and systems in place that really do shape how we're able to do everything from living our lives to work life, to how we raise our families, to how we educate our children. And so again, we want to think about this idea that we all have different levels of power, perhaps, but we also have those in context with systems and structures. So the best way to think about intersectionality and who we are as intersectional people is to really think about either a butterfly, if that is something that appeals to you, or to think about yourself as a Tupac hologram. So yes, I take every opportunity I can to talk about the Tupac hologram. So I'll start with that first. Intersectionality means that no matter how you would like to slice this image of Tupac, and yes, it is an image, and I'm not one of those people who believes he's still alive. You look at this image, you cannot just slice the image and get just a piece of the boot or just his hand in the microphone, right? That's a two-dimensional kind of understanding of how it works. And that's how it's been done in the past. But instead, in intersectionality, no matter how tiny you slice that image of Tupac that's on that stage with Snoop, you are only going to get a little mini Tupac. You are only going to get that entire image in it, no matter how small you slice it. Similarly with a butterfly, and butterflies are symbols of the immigrant rights movement, which is why I use this example. If you just wanted to pull out the race part of your analysis or the gender part of your analysis, and you made the race part the dark purple here and the gender the white dots over here, once you pull out that white dot or once you pull out that purple, dark purple, you're actually destroying the very thing that you're trying to understand. And so the choices that women of color have to make where they're being asked to choose just their gender or just their race, right, are things that, again, not only are not consistent with intersectionality, they're not consistent with how women of color live their lives. And so my friend Lisa puts it the best way. So if you're a baking person, say you don't like butterflies and you don't like Tupac, you can think of it from a baking perspective. Once you've blended the cake, you can't take it back to its main ingredients. So you're not going to be able to go back to the butter and the sugar and the flour. You're going to have to move forward with baking a cake. So when we think about leadership, one of the things we do know about leadership and our concepts that we carry around in our head is that leadership concepts are subject to, like many things in our heads, implicit bias. Now, there's been a lot of work and a lot of talk and discussion about implicit bias. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail on this for the purposes of today, but this is an actual image from an fMRI study of people when their implicit bias is triggered. And so again, what we learn about leadership and who constitutes a leader, we learn just as we learn when we learn our implicit biases. Way back when we were 2 and 3 years old, riding in the back of the minivan or riding in the back of the car with our parents or with our grandparents or caregivers in some way, shape, or form, and we're learning all of those different pieces of information that formulate into implicit bias. We are also learning about in our head, what does a leader look like, right? And often kids will say, oh, a leader is the president of the United States, or a leader is the principal, or the pastor at the church. And so again, to the degree that those have very specific representations of being male, of being a certain race, that's when you start to see that there is this kind of weaving of stereotypes that says what we carry around in our heads about leaders is not consistent with being a woman of color. And so one of the things that there's been a lot of scholarship about has been what happens when women of color break barriers, right? And so, for example, we've just started and launched the Kamala Harris Project because, of course, she is now breaking a barrier, right? And so we're doing this in a nonpartisan fashion to really study what is it going to mean to have a woman of color in the second highest office in the world. And so again, there is a set of studies that talks about breaking barriers, and that's a really important area of research. We do that kind of research here at USC Dornsife in our center, and we do think that that's important. One of the limitations of those implicit bias kinds of studies is that not only are these tests often applied in a single category framework, so you can take the test for race bias, or you can take the test for weight bias, or you can take the test for sex or gender bias. You can't necessarily take intersectional implicit bias tests. And so some of the things that we're doing is to really think about how we can look at different ways of analyzing mental models of leadership that are intersectional, okay? And the reason why we're doing that is because we do need to think of our organizations and organizations, policies, and cultures as interacting with our pre-existing implicit biases, right? So we, for example, Sarah, Octavio, and myself, we get hired by USC Dornsife. And yes, we come in with whatever background and information that we have from our previous experiences. And then we come in and interact with the culture at USC Dornsife. And so again, there's an interaction there rather than just thinking of each one of us as only being the sum of our past experiences. We are also interacting in a culture and a structure, right? And in that culture and structure, we have the opportunity to either perpetuate hierarchies of oppression, right? Or what we end up doing is focusing only on one bias that then locks us into, oh, well, we just need to change at the margins, right? And so what we're going to put forth to you today is that women of color leadership can actually transform how we think about some of these choices in a way that grows the pie, right? And makes it easier to have really substantial change. So you may not be surprised by this image, but if you look at this image, this is just a Google search that, or not a Google search, this is a search that I did in PowerPoint itself for Microsoft Office. And when you Google the word leader, and you search for the word leader, you see that these online pictures, there are very few women that you can see here represented, okay? So the mental models that we have of leadership that we might carry around in our head end up being reinforced by things like this, right? Where just a pure search, you see that what we're talking about in terms of who is a leader is represented as a cis male, often a white cis male. And so we have these images that are coming up when we're trying to search or do, particular presentations that don't necessarily jibe with not only the reality that I started out with. Remember, women of color generating $400 billion in the companies that they start, their entrepreneurship, or women of color ascending to the highest office in the land or the second highest office in the land, or taking on jobs as presidents and provosts and deans of universities. So there are some factors that affect what we mean when we say leader. Certainly that Microsoft search that I just showed you is one example. But another thing of how it interacts with implicit bias that we found is that when we think about leadership in a work context, for example, or even in a nonprofit context or a volunteer context, the ambiguity of the situation, the incomplete information we might have, and then the presence of time constraints can all really factor into how we assess a person's leadership qualities, right? So we often think about, is that person a leader from the perspective of what leadership qualities do they display? And here you can see, just going back one slide, that these are some of, I'm circling over here, these red books, these are some of the qualities that we might think of. Is a leader intelligent? Is a leader honest? Is a leader creative, confident, driven, courageous, right? And so in a short term kind of context where we have to figure out who we're going to hire or who we're going to promote, right? Who we think has what it takes to be the chair of a board or to volunteer in a particular organization. Or even if we're talking about our USC experiences, right? To join an honors fraternity or an honors sorority of some sort. That's when some of those implicit biases can actually come out, right? Because again, we don't know people very, very well. And we don't necessarily know whether or not, right, they have those qualities at stake. They will try and convince us that they do, especially in a job interview or some kind of, interview process. But again, it's an incomplete information situation. And so we rely on those images that we have in our head far more than we might think we should. So as we kind of think through that, women of color have helped to start to redefine what we mean by leadership. And so instead of thinking of leadership as a set of personality traits, like we can see, you're an athlete and you ended up being team captain. And so you displayed skills like being courageous and taking charge and things like that, right? We're actually thinking about, when we study women of color's leadership, that they are actually redefining leadership, not as a set of qualities or personality traits, but in fact as a process, right? And what we mean by that is the idea that the meanings and the practices of how we work together help engage people so that we're not looking just to one leader anymore. We're not looking for just one person who's going to be the head of an organization, where in fact, even if there is a head in name, right, the way in which women of color have been leading is to say we can deputize just about everyone to be a leader in the organization. And the way that they do that is that they don't assume that there is one definition of leadership, right? So typically we think about, if we're going to identify a leader, we have that either set of traits personality-wise that we look for, or we have that mental model in our head that we just talked about. And instead, what we talk about when we're talking about women of color leadership is that we ground our theories of leadership in the experiences of people within the organization. And then we analyze that, looking at how those experiences manifest to achieve a common purpose, right? And so I think that's one of the things that is really important about how women of color leadership studies can actually change what we think about with regard to leadership. Because again, it emphasizes relationship building and collective contributions. So rather than thinking in win-loss, winner, loser, winner take all kinds of contexts, instead, this kind of leadership really is relational and is thought of as being something that is ultimately limitless, meaning that we can continue to grow that leadership out and it being a collective leadership rather than isolated in an individual. So one key takeaway that I want to share with you all from the work that we've done so far is that women of color leadership style, women of color leadership as a definition, meaning that it is accessible to anyone, right? But we found it most with women of color leaders themselves, is that there's a focus on how leaders and followers assign meaning to categories of difference. Like, what does it mean that we are going to look at racial dynamics, gender dynamics, class or sexuality dynamics, citizenship dynamics, right? And so the benefit of using the how versus the who is that leadership becomes a process of co-construction. So again, that deputization process, meaning that we all are responsible, not just that we all have leadership qualities, but we're all equally responsible for advancing the work, right? And this is designed to overcome, right, some of the limitations of prior work. So even though it's been valuable to think about, well, does race or does gender actually serve as a help, or does it serve as a hindrance, right, to what goes on with regard to women of color leaders and with leaders more generally? And that's, again, a very valuable line of research. But what we're talking about is moving that research forward to think through there are other questions and there are other benefits besides the question of whether or not it's a help or a hindrance. And so, what does this look like in real life, right? So, that's a lot of theory, that's a lot of abstract kind of explanation. Well, there are a couple of different ways that this actually works when you think about how group leadership might work, right? And so when we think about that, the processes that are at stake are things like how do agendas get set, right? So whether you're talking about leading in a volunteer context, you're the head of, your church picnic or something like that, or if you're talking about in a business context, right, when you're setting the agenda because you're a part of a project management, situation, um, setting those agendas intersectionally can make a huge difference. And again, that's one of the things that we found out of this Women of Color Leadership study. And so setting the agenda intersectionally means asking questions like not just who's at the table and who's not at the table, but also who's at the table and how is the agenda set to empower them to participate fully in setting the agenda, not just carrying out the agenda once it's been set, right? So that's one of the ways in which, a group leadership process that is women of color leadership oriented is attention to making sure that agendas are set intersectionally. Second way is to really think about how we often end up with what we think is a universal, but it's actually a false universalism, right? And false universalism simply means the idea that we assume, in a kind of groupthink way, we assume that one experience is unique to everyone. And so we can think about that in terms of our own college context, right? We know that at USC Dornsife, there is a tremendous variation in terms of how people study, what people study, the kinds of experiences that they have out of USC Dornsife because we're so large and so diverse. And so it's very difficult to boil that down to one signature, this is the USC Dornsife thing, right? Because again, there are so many things. And so the reason why that's dangerous, of course, in many group leadership situations to kind of rely on false universalism is because you're generally doing things like ignoring some of the very important caveats that might affect how you design a project management process, for example, or how you get certain work done. And then the last thing with regard to group leadership process is that all participants are differentially positioned, and recognizing that all participants are differentially positioned then means that it is not necessary to have one universal tool that applies to everyone. You can have what John Powell calls targeted universalism, meaning that we have all the same goal, like we all want to get the project done, or we all want the project to be a success, but certain folks need certain things in order to be able to fully participate in the process, right? And so if you think about, for example, organizing something in your parent teacher association at your school, if you're a parent. And so the way in which you might think about how different folks have different access to be able to participate in the online planning that's been going on this year for anything that we do at the PTA level, because of course we've been in a pandemic mode and unable to meet in person. And so certain folks are well positioned, they work from home, they have a flexible schedule, they can actually participate whenever the meeting is going to be. Some folks are able to participate, but only during certain hours because they have to work for a living and don't have a flexible schedule. Other folks, of course, don't have the flexibility of working from home. Other folks not only don't have the flexibility from working from home, but don't have the online access or don't have a computer, right? And yet we want everyone to have equal buy-in, equal participation. So what does that look like? And targeted universalism would say we need to figure out how to empower all four of those different constituencies so that they can not just participate equally, but that they can lead equally in the ways in which they contribute. It won't all look the same. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to buy everybody a computer, but it is a sense that we need to be attentive to that so that everyone has a shot at leadership. And it's not just devolving to one particular person who seems to have the mental model that everybody might carry around in their head. The second and final key takeaway is that in order to do any of this, we really do need to build something called intersectional consciousness. And I wrote about this in my second book. And the idea here is that we need to be conscious of these intersectionality principles when we are considering from the very beginning how the system at issue is constructed, right? So when we're looking at a problem or we're confronting a situation that we want to have some type of impact on, we have to think about intersectionality from the very beginning, not build it in at the end on the back end. But again, if we're thinking about from a leadership perspective and deputizing everyone to be a leader, that means involving everyone at the very beginning when we are defining what is the change that we want to actually see in the world. The second step that we do incorporate intersectionality is when once we've identified the change we want to make, we start adjudicating among the possible remedies to pursue. And so again, think about this in terms of the agenda setting, like what's the change, what's the agenda, but then also thinking about how those processes of the agenda getting enacted are actually carried out. And then the third thing is, of course, when we actually infuse the process with more power, which is to say, when we're actually deciding which strategies, right? And we know, again, that power dynamics can come in there with regard to who has the power to make the decision, not just who has the power to make the decision, but who holds people accountable for the decision and whether or not the decision is an actual success, right? And so flipping who might be the people who hold the team accountable, making sure that who's determining what success looks like is intersectionally defined rather than just purely hierarchically defined is one way in which women of color leadership and the studies that we do actually reshape again what it means to lead, right? So it's not just that, boss that you saw in that one image kind of sitting in the chair and making everybody pull in one direction. But nor is it just the one person at the front who's willing to lead and go be ahead of everybody, right? It's very much akin to the idea, again, if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. And so that's really one of the principles that underlies women of color leadership studies and the way in which it works to help us rethink what it means to be a leader. So our Center for Leadership by Women of Color, again, studies many of these things. Happy to answer some questions about it. And really, we focus on, again, not just who leads. So it's not just the fact of their identity as women of color, but it is how they lead. What things do they do differently? And the reason I have a picture of Representative Karen Bass here is she is the representative for USC's UPC campus. That is true. But one of the interesting things that actually got me started in this work was really around when she was elected to the House of Representatives. She had been a state senator, she had been a local nonprofit leader, and so she had been a leader for a long time when she was elected to the House of Representatives. And when she came back for her first visit from Washington, D.C., after getting elected several years ago, she held a town hall meeting to meet with her constituents, as many Congress people do. And she was shocked because no one seemed to want to ask her a tough question, and no one wanted to hold her accountable. And so, again, her style of leadership, her way of leading was that everyone sets the agenda together, everyone determines how we're going to get that agenda achieved, and then everyone is going to be engaged in not just making it a success, but also assessing whether or not it was a success. And so she was really surprised at how there was more of a hope and trust kind of model. And she wanted to change what that looks like. And so she's been working on really changing that. Because again, we understand and value deficit models, right? What are the barriers for women of color leaders? But we also want to think about there are a lot of resources they bring to the table. And Representative Bass's story about how she wants to lead with the community rather than just lead the community and be out in front of it is a really important story. One of the projects we're working on, in addition to the Kamala Harris project, is the Between Past and Future project, which seeks to really link together women leaders of different generations to actually pair them. And so here you have Emma Gonzalez, who's emerged as one of the outstanding Gen Z leaders of the anti-gun violence movement. And you have former Representative Gabby Giffords, who of course is a survivor of gun violence herself and became a very ardent advocate of gun reform based on this experience that she had. So this is just one example of how these cross-generational kinds of partnerships that we would like to pursue. So this is a new project that we're going to be working on. And then last but certainly not least, when we talked about politics and when we talked about the business sector and women's entrepreneurship, in addition to kind of the nonprofit social justice world, we are the only center, very fortunately so, at USC Dornsife that compares women of color across sectors, right? So there are leadership centers at other institutions, and they do focus on the deficit model, or they do focus on, leadership training. And we are focused more on the research and what research has in terms of its applications to teach people about this process of leadership more broadly. So I'm going to stop there. It's about 12:42 Pacific time. So we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. But thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hancock Alfaro. That was so interesting, and I think we could have gone on for like another hour or two. It looks like we have some questions coming in. I encourage everyone who has questions to enter them in your chat box. You can also use the hand raise feature if you would like to ask a question live. I'll kick it off. I actually have a question. So based on your research, leadership is a collective process, right? So how do you overcome those in power who aren't interested in being a team player and helping to cultivate future leaders?
That is a real challenge. You are right. One of the things that we've seen is that when you have a critical mass of folks, you end up being able to convince those leaders, not because those leaders are necessarily convinced it's the right thing to do, but because they know that they don't have any other options. And so again, when we're talking intersectionality, when we're talking women of color leadership, I don't want to make it sound like, it's so soft and relational that it's not pure power politics sometimes. And so I'll just tell one quick anecdote. There was a really wonderful group of boys and young men of color who were advocating for change at the Los Angeles Unified School District level. So they were talking to the school board members and saying, hey, we need to have this funding formula put together so that kids who are most in need will be able to get that access up to resources in their schools. And a school board member very explicitly told them, and they had this more, even though they were young men and boys of color, they had this more, women of color leadership style process that they were using. And the school board member said, I don't agree with you. I don't want to vote for this, but I have no other choice because you have made it impossible for me not to vote for this and to keep my seat, right? And the reason why I bring that example up is not because of that victory. That's actually the small victory, Ivana. The larger victory is, and then when the money came down, that same school board member, along with others, tried to, behind closed doors, reconfigure that formula and say, well, I voted for it in public, but now we're going to try and like dismantle it over here. And those same folks, they filed a lawsuit and they said, we're not going to let you kind of like do behind closed doors what you voted, and not do what you voted for in public. So it definitely takes a village. Let me put it that way.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Can you speak to power dynamics when someone is only a person of color or woman of color in C-suite and the burden of representing all other that tends to fall on their lap?
Yeah, this is definitely one of those outcomes that are related to those mental models that we carry around in our head. And so there's been some research, it's not our personal research, but there's been some research around being the only and the ways in which that has an impact on people's mental health, on their well-being, on their ability, not just to perform, but to also kind of like just live their lives. And so one of the things that we recommend, of course, we recommend critical mass, as I just said, but when there's not a critical mass, I think one of the things that's really important is to recognize where your organization is in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so including that face, that only face, right, is definitely not the same as really changing systems and policies and processes. And so what we often encourage folks to do is to make sure that those systems, policies, and processes are their focus so that you can build out that critical mass. It will take a little bit of time, don't get me wrong, but you really want to think about how those systems and policies and processes that maybe got you or someone you know to be that one person, right, need to shift and expand so that you're expanding not just your network, as we might call it, in this context, but you're also shifting your leadership base of folks who, even if they're not in the C-suite, need to be consulted, right? Because lots of us work in that office where, yeah, there's definitely a hierarchy and there's one boss in charge, right? But there's also that one essential worker, and I know that's a term that we use differently now, but there's that one person that it does not get done if they do not buy in. And so again, that's the kind of leadership base that you want to start to build out, even if they're not in that C-suite level.
Thank you. Next question. Please suggest methods which the mid-level or low-level people can use to get upper-level people to join them in agenda setting.
I'm going to ask just a clarifying question. So I'm going to answer it this way, but if I didn't answer it, you can ask again in the chat. So what I understand your question to be saying is that if higher level folks are not incorporating or including lower level folks in the agenda setting, I think, again, that's something that when we're talking about building out that leadership base, we really do, you want to focus on that in particular, right? So what is that leadership base of folks? And I'm not necessarily talking about unionizing or other things to that effect. What I'm talking more so about is making sure that there is a strong base of co-workers, right, who are able to get certain agendas put together and the case made so that it becomes important or valuable for that particular higher order leader to actually get some buy-in. And so, yes, there are all kinds of things, that you could do that would be kind of more confrontational around like, work and work stoppages and things like that. But here I'm talking more about the idea that you would build out the power among your coworkers, and make sure that you are elevating folks into some of those higher places in leadership so that they can be transformed. And so again, long-term process, not the kind of like right away, it will get you there in 6 months. But I do think that, again, there is power in that collectivity process, that really does help leaders understand that the bottom line can actually improve, in many ways. And there are some studies that kind of support that.
Thank you. Just to let everyone know, we're still taking questions. We still have about 10 minutes, so don't be shy. If you want to hand raise and ask a question, feel free, or if you want to ask a question in the chat box, please do that. Can you tell us what you're most excited to study at your center in the future? Do you mind sharing that with us?
Oh boy. There's a couple of things. I talked a little bit about them in the presentation, but I'll talk about the two that we're working on right now. So the one that we just launched in January is the Kamala Harris Project. And what we're doing there is we are collecting as much as possible every bit of scholarship and research that's going to be done over the next 4 years. So we're going to be tracking all of the different things that are happening with regard to having a first woman of color vice president in US history. And so we're having a symposium on May 7th, where we'll be talking about her first 100 days in office, and some of the different things that have happened. We'll also be talking about media representations of her. And so again, this is a scholarship and research-based effort. So we're really, really excited about that, because again, we want to create an archive of what that leadership looks like at the highest levels of US power. And then the second thing I alluded to is something that we're going to be getting off the ground, hopefully very soon, which is our Between Past and Future, where we look to different activists and we look to different people who are different generations, but maybe need to have a conversation or need to be brought into conversation with each other so that they can come up with and generate something really new and different and interesting. So the Gabby Giffords, Emma Gonzalez pairing that you saw in the presentation is really our kind of dream kind of connection. But we're also really excited about applying for some funding to get that off the ground.
Thank you. I'm not sure if we have any. Oh, let's see.
Oh, yep.
Here's one. How do you expect how people view women of color in leadership to change with the election of Kamala Harris, sorry.
So I expect it, I'll be honest, I actually expect it to be fairly slow going. And I say that for the reason, of course, that as a political scientist, I do have to acknowledge that we are very politically polarized in our country right now. And so I don't expect that in 4 years from now, people will be perfectly comfortable with having a woman of color vice president. That said, I do think that her candidacy is really more of a symbol of how far women of color leaders have come, rather than kind of the tip of the iceberg, if that makes sense. So in other words, I think she is part of a broader wave of women of color leadership that will be really important. And I think that broader wave is what will have the impact. So I don't want to minimize her or minimize, her impact, but I do want to put her in context with a host of other women of color leaders who are doing pretty amazing things.
Thank you. It looks like we have a couple of people who have raised their hands. I'm going to go to David.
Hi, Professor Hancock Alfaro. It's been a while. I have a question. So how can men, especially men of color, be better advocates for and supporters of women in the workplace?
That's a really good question. And I want to take it in two directions. One, your direction, David, and it is so good to see you. Yes, I do remember you from Sex, Power, and Politics all the way back in the day. But I want to take it in the direction you've asked about how men of color can be supportive of women of color in the workplace. I do think, again, one of the nice things about this women of color leadership model and using leadership as a process is that it's not you don't have to be a woman of color to actually use it, right? And so I think that some of the tools that we were talking about, cultivating an intersectional consciousness, for example, making sure that you're setting agendas intersectionally, those are all things that men of color can do just as much as women of color can do. And then the last thing I'll say is kind of related to some of the tragedies that we saw last week, in the last couple of weeks against Asian Americans and Asian American women in particular. I think the last thing that I always want to offer folks who want to be in solidarity with particular populations is to hand over the mic. And just make sure that you're amplifying rather than speaking for. And so that's the other kind of thing that that's sometimes what happens when you do get locked into false universalism, right? And you think that, well, I'm Asian American or I'm a person of color, and so I can actually speak for, Asian American women, or I can speak for women of color. And in fact, what's necessary is to hand over the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. We'll move on to Jay Lopez.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Jay Lopez Van Soest. Good afternoon. I wanted to talk a little bit, if you could talk a little bit more about something, a term I wasn't familiar with, which was targeted universalism. So I most recently worked for a disability advocacy organization and had, so we recognize that universal design, both in, like, for example, products and services, web designs, et cetera, that, universal design was kind of on the way out, and actually that there was no such thing as universal design. But we were moving towards inclusive design. And for example, accessibility first was an ethos. And this was a term that I wasn't familiar with, and I was hoping that you could maybe talk a little bit more about that, because that was kind of, I keep thinking about, like, so if I own a bed and breakfast and I have 12 guests, and I'm just thinking, gosh, I get up every morning and I have to make like eggs 12 different ways. And that just kind of is a little scary to me. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. And thanks for your question and your work. So what we're talking about when we talk about targeted universalism is true in the sense of, so you've got a little bit of the gist of it, that we could have a universal goal, right? And so things like inclusive design and accessibility first are certainly part of what we would think about in terms of targeted universalism. What it traditionally means is that we can have a universal goal, right? And the pathways to get there are different, right? So for example, when I teach this in my classes, what I traditionally talk about is that we might want every person in the country to graduate from high school, right? And we know, for example, that there are multiple equally legitimate paths to get to graduate from high school, right? Some people go the 4 years in person that you might see on TV as kind of the stereotype of how you do high school. Some people might get a GED. Some people might do online education for whatever reason. Some people might skip a grade and do 3 years versus 4 years, right? But we know that ultimately all of those paths, there are groups of people for whom those paths might work better or worse, right? And that not everyone thrives in one particular path. And so targeted universalism is the idea that when we're setting policy, we could have that universal goal of everybody graduating from high school, everybody having a diploma, a high school diploma, but recognizing instead of trying to shoehorn people into one particular lane or even two particular lanes, to say that we need to do the work to figure out what are the 3-4 lanes, not 12, but what are the 3-4 lanes, right, that most folks fit into, and to make sure we're dedicating resources to those 3 or 4 lanes rather than simply saying this is the one lane and everybody's got to fit into it. And so it's actually consistent with, although I don't think it benefited, like I think it was written as the disability rights movement was kind of coming online and doing having a lot of great impact. So I think they're kind of concurrent in the history. It's definitely consistent with, I think, some of the logics that you see in even crip theory and other, kind of more forward, critical approaches to disability and ability rights.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Octavio wants to know, how do you recommend a person in a leadership position who is intersectionality conscious work with a staff member who filters their thoughts and actions predominantly through one identity, and as a result, the leader's efforts are not satisfactory?
That's a really good question, Octavio. So there are kind of two things to think about there. One is, yes, there is this need to honor the individual, right? And to know where they are and kind of how they're thinking about things. I think this is where the benefits of intersectionality, not just being about identity though, can really be helpful. And so again, an intersectionally conscious leader absolutely would want to engage with someone, and all of who they are, even though that person might be just filtering through race or just filtering through gender or some other identity. But they would also want to encourage that person to really think through the structures and the systems and the policies and the processes that they are navigating. And often what ends up happening is that you're not necessarily interacting with that person about that person's experience, but that person ends up learning more about intersectionality by being able to deeply understand how other people are experiencing that same process, right? And not just experiencing it through that one lens of race or gender or class or sexuality, but instead how they're experiencing it holistically as a whole person. And so I think that's one of the ways in which, as an intersectionally conscious boss, you can actually pivot back and say, well, we're still doing intersectionality, even as this person, again, for them, is really fully embracing a particular identity. And that the good news is, and I hesitate to call it good news, it's just news. But the good news is it does actually shift and change over time, again, based on events. Based on what goes on in the world. And so people may, in fact, shift and change how they identify, of course, based on a number of different current events, but also policies and processes about that could potentially empower them to identify differently.
Thank you. Are there opportunities to volunteer at the center to not only support its efforts, but also to learn more?
Yes, absolutely. They will not start up until we get back in person. I'll be transparent about that. So hopefully that will be in the fall. But we do have, and I'm happy to provide to Sarah and Octavio, and they can share it with everyone who's been on the call today. We will have a Zoom link for our symposium if you want to come to our symposium on May 7th, just to start getting your feet wet. You can follow us on Twitter, the Kamala Harris Project. And you can also follow us on Facebook. We have the Kamala Harris Project as a Facebook page right now. And then once we get our center up and running, well, our center is up and running. Once we get our website for our center up and running, we'll be sure to share that URL as well, because that will be the best place to check us out.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Hancock Alfaro, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed this. And I think we're all lucky to have had you and your words of wisdom for the hour. Thank you for the leadership tools and lessons and for sharing your research. I know you mentioned some websites. is that where alumni will go to connect with you and to learn more about your research? Or do you want to give an email address or another website?
I'm happy to post my Twitter handle and also my email address in the chat. But thank you again for hosting me. This was a really, really cool opportunity to engage with you.
Thank you. So for everyone, I think we're now going to move into our networking session. It's a great opportunity to meet fellow Trojans, just as if we were in person together.